This week's case is about an unsolved mystery from the 1930s. But like other unsolved mysteries I've done, do they really know who did it and they escaped from justice? Well, let's get started. Hello everyone, my name is Brandy and I'm bringing you a true crime case or mystery with one or more of my fabulous felines. If you are a returning subscriber, welcome back my feline friends, and a big shout out to my feline fans who help support this channel. So thank you everyone for understanding that I needed a break last week. I had all the research done for this case and I was working on the script and I just kept procrastinating and I just wasn't feeling it. You know, there has just been so much going on lately that I just think I was kind of burnt out. Now, this last weekend, I was able to go to a psychic fair and I had a tarot card reading. It was the first time I ever had a tarot card reading, and let me tell you, this gal was amazing. I literally just sat down, told her my name, and she started reading the cards. There was no small talk or chit chat beforehand where she could almost like glean information off. I literally just sat down and told her my name. Now, basically, the cards were telling her that I was in an internal conflict with myself, which was 100% true. I am struggling with work-life balance. My life lately has only consisted of my full-time job and making YouTube videos. There was no time for, like fun. This psychic fair was the first time in months that I just took some time and said, heck with the chores, let's go to this psychic fair to see what it's about. Now, I'm not saying making YouTube videos is not fun, but between the research, filming, and editing, there is some work involved, so you can get a burnout sometimes. I also felt the connection between my husband and I was a little off. We just celebrated our 22nd wedding anniversary this month, and we didn't do anything to celebrate. Like, we usually go out to dinner or a movie or Netflix and chill, but we didn't do any of that. We were just so busy. It was happy anniversary, I love you, and back to work. So I did a lot of thinking and some self-reflection. The conclusion I came to is I'm going to alter my YouTube schedule. What I'm going to do is I'll start doing a true crime case or mystery every 2 weeks instead of every week. And then in those off weeks when I'm not doing a true crime case or mystery, I can focus on the easier videos like getting through the Meet the Felines, product reviews, and even just feline fun videos. And this might be a temporary change just through the summer because I feel like we're so busy. And maybe in the winter I'll go back to every week. We'll just see what happens. But I know you understand the reason for this change, and because we're all going through it, right? We all struggle to find that work-life balance. Plus, you are all awesome and I love you, so thank you. And I know this video is coming out on April Fool's Day, so this is not an April Fool's Day joke. I really am going to change my YouTube schedule. Bad timing, I know. Okay, now that I've poured my heart out, let's get started with this week's case. So this case is about the Cleveland torso killer. Before we get started, do not confuse this case with the Times Square torso killer. Yeah, there were two. Who knew? Anyway, Richard Cottingham, who was the Times Square torso killer, which is on my list to cover, don't worry, he was different. Okay, in this case, the serial killer was in Cleveland and he was technically never identified. This killer is also known as the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run as well. So this killer was active between the years of 1935 and 1938 in Cleveland, Ohio. The MO of this killer is that he dismembered his victims. Mainly, he would cut off their head and most times would cut off their appendages as well. Now, most of the bodies would end up being dumped in an impoverished neighborhood called Kingsbury Run. Kingsbury Run was known for its bars, gambling, brothels, and just vagrants because it was next to the train tracks as well. It was also called a hobo jungle because it was just a bunch of like tents and shacks that people lived in. It was bleak and it was a dangerous place, as you can imagine. There were many poor people that lived in terrible conditions. Now remember, the Great Depression happened in 1929 and went on for years. So right now in this era, there is a lot of people that were stricken with poverty around this time. Now there are 12 known victims of this killer, but recent research as late as 1997 has stated there could be up to 20 victims that this killer was known for. Now, investigators over the years have stated not only was the killer active in Cleveland, but also in Youngstown, Ohio, and as far away as Pennsylvania and maybe California. Now, the victims were usually like drifters, vagrants, sex workers, and generally those just down on their luck living in the Kingsbury Run area. And unfortunately, a lot of these victims were never identified. These types of people were easy prey at the time, and not many people paid too much attention if these types of people disappeared. Now, along with decapitating the victims, the killer would also emasculate the males. He'd cut off their man parts. Now, most of the victims' bodies were found like days after that they were murdered, that they were killed. But some of them were found months to years later. And sometimes the head was never found. So let's go through the victims that were actually tied to this case. On September 23rd, 1995, 2 bodies were discovered in Kingsbury Run. The first victim was named John Doe 1. He was decapitated and emasculated. It was determined that he was killed 3 to 4 weeks before he was discovered, and they did find his head. Now, the second victim was found the same day, only 30 yards away. This victim was also decapitated and emasculated, and they did find his head, but they were able to identify this victim as Edward Andrassy. Edward was estimated to be killed 2 to 3 days prior to his body being found. So Edward was an orderly, and he spent a lot of time in the gambling dens of Kingsbury Run. So the police initially thought that maybe these 2 victims were victims of like gambling debts. But more victims would be found later. Now, the third victim was found on January 26, 1936, and her name was Florence Genevieve Hellelio. She had been dismembered, and her body parts were actually found in 2 bushel baskets next to like a manufacturing building, and her head was there as well. Now, Florence was a bar waitress, but she was also known to be a sex worker who worked and lived in Kingsbury Run. So police then began to realize that these victims actually went beyond gambling debts. The fourth victim was labeled as John Doe 2. He was found on June 1936. Well, his head was found that day. Yeah. The next day, his body was found in front of the police building. Yeah, obviously it wasn't there a day before. So the killer had dumped the head and then dumped the body in front of the police building. And at this point, the police felt like they were being mocked. Like, haha, can't catch me. Even when I dump a body right in front of your police station. The John Doe 2 was determined to be killed 2 days prior. Now, at this point in the body buildup, a man named Elliot Ness would become the lead investigator on this case. In 1936, he was appointed the safety officer of the city after the fourth victim was found. Now, Elliot seemed like the perfect man for the job because before he came to Cleveland, he actually took on gangsters like Al Capone, and he helped enforce the prohibition laws at the time. Elliot would go on to help revitalize the police department because apparently it was wrought with some corruption and police had gotten lazy due to some political issues. It always comes down to politics, doesn't it? Elliot was nicknamed the Untouchable because of his sterling reputation. So Elliot and another investigator named Peter Murillo worked hard on this case trying to find the killer. Peter would even go undercover as a vagrant to try and catch the killer, but was unsuccessful. And the bodies continue to pile up. The next victim found was John Doe 3, found in July 22nd, 1936. Now, this is where the coroner believed that this man was dismembered while he was still alive. Yikes. Now, his head was recovered, and it was determined that he was killed 2 months prior to being found. Now, this was the only victim that seemed to be killed where the body was found due to the blood evidence on the ground. The victims before, they were killed elsewhere and then dumped. This guy actually was killed where he lay. This made Elliot and Peter think that the victim either escaped and the killer panicked and had to, take him out right now, or the killer's drive was so strong that they needed that instant gratification, which is sort of scary. John Doe 4 was found, but only half his torso was found, and there was nothing below the hips. The head was never recovered, and it was determined that he was killed 2 days prior. Now, this victim showed that the decapitation was done with precision, one stroke. And so authorities started wondering, is the killer a doctor or someone schooled in anatomy to make these precision cuts the way they were? So 5 months later, Jane Doe 1 was found, February 22nd, 1937. So there were times between these killings. Well, at least there were times between when the bodies were found because they were in various states of decay when dumped. Her head was never found, and she was determined that she was killed 2 to 3 days prior. Now, Jane Doe 2, who authorities believed was actually named Rose Wallace, was found June 6th, 1937. Now, Jane Doe 2 was determined to be killed a full year before she was found. Well, why? Well, because they found her skull, and next to her skull was just a bag of bones, literal bones. And they never 100% identified that Jane Doe 2 was Rose Wallace. The only information they were going off of was from Rose Wallace's son, saying that his mother was missing and she had some gold dental work and the skull had gold teeth. Now, they did determine that this victim was African American, and so was Rose, and she was considered the only African American killed by this serial killer. On July 6th, 1937, John Doe 5 was found. His head was never recovered, and it was determined that he was killed 2 days prior. Now, the difference with John Doe 5 is that, when they just found his torso, his heart had been ripped out, which was sort of a new twist in this case in the victims. So the killer was escalating for some reason, and the heart was never found. Now, after John Doe 5 was found, things seemed to kind of cool off a bit. It was almost an entire year later, in April of 1938, that Jane Doe 3 was found, but only her lower legs were recovered at that time. On May 2nd, a human thigh was found in the river. When they searched the river further, They found a burlap sack that was actually under a bridge, and it contained her torso that was cut in half, her other thigh, and her left foot. Her head and remaining body parts were never found. And she was determined that she had died 3 to 5 days prior. Now, this was the first victim where actual drugs were found in her system. So it led authorities to wonder, like, is this just somebody who was doing drugs recreationally and came upon the wrong person? Or did the killer drug her so he could dismember her alive? So on August 16th, 1938, the last 2 victims were found. There was Jane Doe 4, who had been decapitated. Her head was found, and she died 4 to 6 months prior. And at the same time, the bodies were just right beside each other. John Doe 6 was discovered. He was decapitated, emasculated. His head was found in a can, and he was determined that he died 7 to 9 months prior. So interesting fact on where these 2 bodies were actually dumped. The killer was taunting Elliot Ness by dumping the bodies right outside of Elliot's office window at City Hall. Talk about the balls on this killer. Elliot knew for a fact that this killer was now taunting him. More on that later. Now, there were other potential victims of this killer, but these victims were never officially linked to the case. There was a female nicknamed Lady of the Water that was found on the Lake Erie shore in 1934. If she was linked to this case, she would have been the very first victim of this killer. There were also several headless victims found in like the train cars in Pennsylvania, and they had all the same like injuries that the Cleveland bodies did, but they never officially tied it to this case. And in 1950, a man named Robert Robertson, yep, that was his name. He was a 41-year-old man, and he was found decapitated in Cleveland. Now, this would have been way after the supposed last bodies were found. Even though his death fit the profile of the Cleveland torso killer, police did treat this as an isolated incident. And finally, there's the famous case of Black Dahlia. Many say that she was a victim of the Cleveland torso killer, even though that her murder took place in 1947 in Los Angeles. So who possibly could be responsible for these murders? After the last 2 victims were placed outside of Elliot's office window, Elliot was so mad about this that he got a group of policemen, and 2 days later, they went to Kingsbury Run and did a raid. They were looking in all the shacks and tents for any sort of evidence of the killer. And when they didn't find any, Elliot demanded that the policemen burn all the shacks and tents down. Now, this move would obviously be looked down upon by the public because there were consequences to what Elliot had done. First of all, once the shacks and tents were burnt, the vagrants and, those just living in poverty were then homeless because they had no place to go. And homeless was considered a crime back then. So they were all charged with a crime. It's ironic because the only reason they were homeless was because the authorities burnt down their shack or tent. Now, Elliot would come out later and try to explain his actions to, kind of smooth it over with the public. But I don't know if I agree with his explanation. What he said is that he was protecting the transients and vagrants of Kingsbury Run. By charging them with a crime, he was now getting their fingerprints. And there were 2 reasons why he needed fingerprints. 1 is to hopefully catch the killer. And 2, if the vagrants or transients ever become a victim, they would be easily identified. Okay. Then Elliot would go on to say by, effectively removing Kingsbury Run as a, pool of people to prey upon, the killings would also stop. Now, whether this raid was the reason or not, the murders technically did stop. So, was Elliot a genius, or did he just get lucky? Either way, his reputation was severely damaged due to his actions. Now on to the suspects. There was only one person actually arrested and charged with these crimes, and his name was Frank Dozal. Now, Frank was a 52-year-old man. He frequented Kingsbury Run as for the bars, gambling, and, brothels. Now, Frank was a bricklayer, and he actually had lived with Florence, who was the third victim, for a while. And he also knew Edward Andrassy, who was the second victim. And there was a connection he had with Rose Wallace, who was also referred to as Jane Doe 2. So police were like, yep, connection made, we found our man. Frank would confess to killing Florence, sort of. See, his confession was very kind of an incoherent rambling, and he had some precise details in there, but many people thought his confession was more coached on what to say than him actually committing any crimes. Now later, Frank would recant his confession and say that he was beaten by police in order to give a confession. When a doctor examined Frank, it was discovered that he actually had 6 broken ribs that happened while he was in police custody. So now, before Frank was actually set to go to trial, he was found dead in his jail cell. Now, Frank supposedly hung himself with a bedsheet, but it was under some mysterious circumstances. You see, Frank was 5'8" tall, and when he hung himself, he was only hanging 5'7" from the floor. So technically he could stand up, and you know how hard it is to hang yourself and not try to save yourself? Now, an autopsy was done, and the notes in the autopsy report had questioned how he had actually died, but they do not come out and say that he was murdered. So, yeah, what really happened there? Now, virtually no one, even in the public, thought that Frank did these crimes. And in 2010, the city put a marker on his grave that said, "Rest now." And that was their way of vindicating Frank from these crimes and proclaim his true innocence. So rest in peace, Frank. I'm sorry this happened to you. The other suspect in this case was often called the secret suspect, and it was somebody that Elliot Ness was on top of. But this suspect was never officially charged, and here's why. Elliot thought that a doctor named Dr. Francis Sweeney was responsible for these murders. Francis was part of a medical unit in World War I, and guess what his specialty was? Amputations. That's what he did in the medical unit in the World War I. Now, after the war, Francis became an alcoholic and very unstable, probably due to his war experiences. Francis was also very abusive to his wife and 2 sons. His wife would report that he would be away for days on what she assumed were drunken binges, and eventually he would start neglecting his medical practice. So in May of 1938, Elliot had illegally apprehended Francis and kept him in a hotel room for 14 days. Miranda rights weren't really a thing yet, but keeping someone in a hotel room against your will was against their civil liberties of the time. It was said that Francis was so drunk when he was apprehended that it took him 3 days to sober up in order to be questioned. Whew, that's a drunken binge. Now, once Francis had sobered up, Elliot had brought in a polygraph test expert and gave Francis 2 different polygraph tests, which Francis failed both. The polygraph expert had even told Elliot that is your man, and if I am wrong, I'm going to throw my polygraph machine right out the window. However, Elliot was up against a wall in trying to charge Francis, and it was going to be a long shot to even get him in court. The problem was they had very little evidence to actually tie Francis to these crimes. Everything that Elliot had on Francis was circumstantial. I mean, they did have the polygraph tests, but since they apprehended and held Francis illegally, those weren't probably going to be admissible in court. There was also some political things going on. See, Dr. Francis Sweeney, his first cousin, was a congressman named Martin Sweeney. And Francis Sweeney came from a very prominent family in Cleveland. So Francis had some friends in high places that could probably, get him out of trouble. So Elliot had no choice but to let Francis go after 14 days of holding him in his hotel room. And after letting him go, 3 months later, those 2 bodies showed up outside of Elliot's office window. Now, after those 2 bodies were found outside of Elliot's office window, Francis would end up committing himself into a mental institution in 1938, right after the Kingsbury Run raid, where they set everything on fire, and the killings stopped. But again, is it because Francis was really the killer and took himself off the street, or did the raid scare the killer away? Don't know. Now, Francis was eventually diagnosed with schizophrenia, and he never left the mental hospital. However, Francis would keep harassing Elliot through postcards and sending him letters, and he would harass Elliot and his family up until the 1950s. The official last death tied to the killer was in 1938, so the timeline fits that Francis could be the killer, unless you want to count the murders that were never officially tied to the case. Then we have a killer still committing a murder up until 1950. So again, it's questionable. Because Elliot was unable to tie anything to Francis, Francis was never charged with any of these murders. Francis would end up dying in the mental hospital in 1964. Now, there was another theory that came out in 1997, 50 years after all these killings, was that there was no single killer, that these were done by different people, and they may have known each other, but they just went on a rampage, I guess. Now, this was due to a variety of factors that this theory came about. So back in the 1930s, forensic science was in its infancy, okay? So the autopsies weren't always consistent the way they were done. So similarities or differences could be swapped. Now, the first coroner at the time that did autopsies on like the first half of the bodies that were found, he was questioned on whether he could tell the difference between like a precision cut or a novice cut. And he did admit that unless it was 100% positive that it was precision, he probably really couldn't tell the difference. Then another coroner that came later and did the other half of the body's autopsies, he loved the media attention. So he would go out and talk to the media, and he would just spew these sensational theories and stories that everyone just ate up and would hinder the investigation. Now, the main problem is that, no one came up with a motive of why, if it was a single killer, why they do this, besides someone just being horrible person. And unfortunately, most of the official police records and everything in this case had been lost or damaged since the 1930s. Now, Elliot would end up running for governor in 1947, but he was unsuccessful. Elliot would pass away in 1957, a broken man and in poverty. He had turned to alcohol to cope. Elliot always believed that Dr. Francis Sweeney was the killer, and Elliot went to his grave believing that he had solved the case but was unable to convict Francis. 40 years after Elliot's death, the city of Cleveland did hold a funeral for Elliot with full police honors, and they scattered his ashes in a cemetery close to Kingsbury Run. In 2011, a daughter of one of the initial detectives on the case came forward to the Cleveland Police Museum and stated that she had copies of some files that her father had kept all these years. The files included autopsies, hospital records, interviews, and even lunacy hearings on Francis. So that helped shed some light on some things for future researchers. In 2014, James Badal, who was a case expert and had been researching this case for 18 years, had came to the same conclusion as Eliot Ness, that Dr. Francis Sweeney was most likely the killer. But again, he said the evidence was very much circumstantial. James would state that his conclusion came from evidence such as, in 1934, a vagrant had came forward to police stating that a doctor had attempted to drug him, but the vagrant was able to escape. The vagrant said that the doctor that he was at, his office, was somewhere between East 50th and East 55th Street on Broadway Street. Now, authorities did drive around this area, but they never found anything that looked like a medical practice. So the vagrant's story was quickly dismissed. However, James Badal had discovered that Dr. Francis Sweeney had his medical practice at the corner of Broadway Street and 50th, but it didn't look like a medical practice. It was a very modest looking building, and there was no sign to clearly post that this was a medical practice. Now, the main question in all of this was that if Francis was actually doing these murders at his medical practice, there would be some blood evidence around, right? I mean, after all, he was dismembering bodies. So it was suggested by another researcher that Francis may have had an agreement with an undertaker. Now, he would tell this undertaker that he was going to, practice surgery on these unclaimed bodies or unknown vagrants, and then use the undertaker's facility to do that, and then all the blood evidence would be gone, right? Nobody thinks to look at an undertaking facility for murder. And according to James Badal's research, right next door to Francis's medical facility was a funeral home. And that funeral home had a concrete ramp behind the building to access the undertaking facility. Where Francis' medical practice was and the undertaking facility, it was a very short trip, like 10 minutes from Kingsbury Run. So Francis could have been luring or finding victims in his medical practice, knowing they were vagrants or whatever, and then taking them next door to the undertaking facility, doing what he needs to do, and then dumping the bodies back in Kingsbury Run. I think I'm convinced. Now, in the Cleveland Police Museum, there is a display that is dedicated to the Cleveland torso murders, and it includes pictures, information, and even death masks of those victims that were found, well, where their heads were found. So what are your thoughts? Do you think the killer was Dr. Francis Sweeney? Or do you think it was multiple killers? Or do you think they even caught the killer, that they were way off? I'd love to hear what you think in the comments down below. If you would like to become a feline friend, just hit that subscribe button. And if you would like to become a feline fan, please hit that join button for special perks. Thank you, everyone, and I will see you in 2 weeks with another true crime case or mystery. Bye, guys.